Social Security is one of the most complex and confusing federal programs. With over 2,700 rules, it's no wonder that we're confused about when and how to start collecting and who to turn to for help. Welcome to Social Security Answers from the Experts, hosted by Martha Shedden. In this podcast series, Martha meets with professionals to provide you with the answers to questions about this most important financial decision. And now, here's your host, President and co-founder of the National Association of Registered Social Security Analysts, Martha Shedden.
Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the podcast. I am your host, Martha Shedden, and today I have the pleasure and honor of welcoming Nancy Altman to the podcast. Nancy's been an advocate, advisor, instructor, author, thought leader, and all-around front row participant on Social Security and private pensions for nearly 50 years. In the mid-1980s, she was on the organizing committee and the first board of directors of the National Academy of Social Insurance and received the Robert M. Ball Award from the Academy in 2018, which is presented to an individual who has made significant contributions to strengthening social insurance for Americans. Nancy's currently president of Social Security Works, chair of the Strengthened Social Security Coalition, and is serving a 6-year term on the Social Security Advisory Board, an independent bipartisan federal agency that advises the President, Congress, and the Commissioner of Social Security. With an AB degree from Harvard and a JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School, Nancy has authored numerous books, published op-eds in dozens of newspapers, and shared her Social Security expertise on numerous television and radio shows. So welcome to the show, Nancy.
Thank you so much for having me.
With this podcast, as you know, we aim to help financial professionals and workers understand Social Security. Your background on this topic is so extensive, and so I want to just make doubly sure that our listeners appreciate what you're sharing here with us today. Right out of college and law school, you were a tax lawyer for several years, handling a variety of private pension matters, and then you became a legislative assistant to Senator John Danforth, advising him on Social Security matters. How did you become interested in social insurance topics? Was it something about how you were raised? Was it your experience in the Bachelor of Arts Studies, law school? What led you down this path?
Well, in some ways, I feel like it was meant to be, because I started working in tax law in 1974 when the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974 was enacted. That was a wide-ranging legislation regulating private pensions, which before then had many problems with insecurity. And every pension plan in the country had to be modified. As a consequence, tax lawyers or labor law lawyers, it was different in different law firms, immediately were put to work on pensions. So that really was the pension side. Then I decided I really was interested in the public sector, went to work for a new senator from Missouri, John Danforth, who was on the finance committee, just as the Social Security amendments of 1977 were working their way through Congress. So I got at a very start of my career, private pensions and Social Security. Then I had the good fortune to be Alan Greenspan's assistant on the bipartisan commission that led to the Social Security amendments of 1983, and was really privileged to work closely with 3 men who started working on Social Security in the 1930s, 2 of them in 1934. Social Security was enacted in 1935, but they were hired to be part of the New Deal group that put together the amendments. The third was the man you mentioned, Bob Ball, who started in the field office in 1939. As a consequence, as you say, I've had a first row seat. And I like to say to people that as they listen to me, there's a continuous thread going back to Franklin Roosevelt and Francis Perkins Arthur Altmeyer, who was the first commissioner, because the three men, Bob Ball, Bob Myers, longest serving actuary, Wilbur Cohen, who rose to be Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, now HHS, started as young men in the 1930s, and they were privileged to work with Roosevelt and Perkins and the others. And then I had, at the start of my career, was privileged to work with them. And now I'm very fortunate to be working with lots of people, younger people, and who are now committed to carrying on the legacy of Social Security.
You've definitely had a front row seat for the whole time, especially with that legacy, with everyone that's mentored you. My next question was regarding your position as assistant to Alan Greenspan when he was chairman for the bipartisan commission that developed the 1983 Social Security amendments. And I'm such a Social Security geek. I'm just curious what that was like. Those were major changes to the Social Security program. What can you share with our listeners about the work involved and the passage of those amendments?
Well, it's fascinating that, and again, these three men that I just mentioned were instrumental parts of it. The commission really was started out in some ways as a rising out of the ashes of the failure. Everyone knew because of the economy at the time, there was what was called at that time stagflation, with very high inflation and high unemployment. And those kinds of conditions, and just a few years before, Social Security had been automatically indexed. Before that, Congress acted every 2 years or so to raise benefits. And they enacted it in such a way that if the economy, as had been historical, had been going on, everything would have been fine. But this particular high unemployment, high inflation, because of the way they had structured the automatic indexing, it really was over-indexing. So it became very clear right away that Social Security was projecting a shortfall. Congress knew it. President Ford at the time proposed a plan, but it was 1976. So people, it was election year. Congress didn't act on it. 1977, President Carter proposed it. That's when I started working on the Hill. That was enacted, but they thought they had put it into balance, but actually inflation and unemployment got worse. So just a few years, they said, okay, we have a problem. Congress was working on it, but at that point, the Reagan administration had just come in and they really overplayed their hand. David Stockman, who was OMB director, was really hostile to the program. And he used it as an excuse to propose very deep cuts to people who are just about to retire, something you really can't.
Don't do that. No.
And the phones were ringing off the hook. And as a compromise, the commission was established. I'm giving you a little bit of a long answer, but I think this is really important.
It's fascinating to me because they accomplished so much relatively quickly, it seems.
Yes, very quickly. And at the very least, it was to get them through the 1982 election because there was so much concern about it. But it was set up so that it was 15 members, 3 appointed by the president, 3 by the Senate, which was controlled by the Republicans, but it was 3 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and 5, and then 5 by the House of Representatives. The people who were put on it was the chairman of the Finance Committee and Ways and Means Committee and the ranking members, and also the head of the AFL-CIO, business representatives, Claude Pepper, who was then seen as he was there fighting for the seniors, from a representative from Florida. It was such a wide range of views that nobody thought it would succeed. But if it did succeed, no one was going to stop it because it was, I consider it like a conference committee before as it's working its way through Congress. It had all the interest groups. And as I said, Bob Ball was a member, Bob Myers was the executive director, and Wilbur Cohen was head of an outside activist group trying to make sure the changes were done well. And it was, and I can go into more detail if you want, but it was on the one hand, it was what it's what I often say about people and their own qualities. Sometimes your biggest strength is also your biggest weakness, or your biggest weakness is also your biggest strength. And in this case, the range of views was weakness. It was hard to reach agreement, but once they decided they were going to reach agreement and they were willing to compromise, it really was something that has lasted until now.
For 50 years. And
That's
it's
right.
they had that buy-in then from all these different representative voices that we're not seeing that today.
Well, and that's really one of the big differences between then and now, that there have been a number of groups that they claim are modeled after the Greenspan Commission, the Bowles-Simpson Commission and others, but those tended to be much narrower group of people, not representing people on the outside, no one really knowing what was going on, and with a real fixed agenda. This one was real honest debate. There were those who wanted to see the program expanded. There were those who wanted to cut back on it, and they were willing to talk. And they were, Bob Ball, again, who we mentioned a few times, was really a master. He was the most amazing negotiator I've ever seen. He always knew, he was always thinking about what the other side wanted, the other side needed, and what he could concede that wouldn't violate his basic principles. He was very principled. I used to joke that he was more prepared than anyone. He could make the other side's arguments better than they could. And he really understood it all. And I think his view was that he wanted to make sure that this basic structure, because there was a lot of talk back then about privatization and so forth. Yeah. He wanted to make sure that the basic structure, which has stood the test of time, would remain, and it did. And he was willing to have some. They delayed the cost of living adjustment. They raised the retirement age. So there were concessions that were made, although the raising the retirement age was actually, the commission, that was the one thing the commission did not agree on. The progressives wanted a rate increase in the Social Security contribution rate. The conservatives wanted a benefit cut in the form of an increase in the retirement age. And the report left that to Congress, and there was a vote in Congress, but it was done in the open with a vote on the floor of the House and the Senate. Anyone could have amended it, but everyone was agreed that something had to be done, and this really was the best they could get.
Yeah, it's amazing. It stood the test of all this time, and that we're just now using up the surplus, which most people don't even understand that. But I'm just keeping my fingers crossed for the next decade or so.
Oh, it will, and one thing that I say when young people, because, I sort of joke when I'm speaking to young people, but it's really not a joke. When I was in the early 1980s, when I was just starting my career and working on the Social Security Commission, I was told I would not see my benefits. The program was going bankrupt. And I laughed that 50 years later, it's now my children and grandchildren who won't see. It used to be the greedy geezers who wouldn't. I was the victim, and now I've become the victimizer. I'm a Social Security age, and they're not going to see their benefits. The reality is that Social Security is current funded, which means that as long as we have a workforce, people will get benefits. And I like to tell young people that although we think of it as a retirement program, and that's an extremely important part, it provides disability insurance, often the only disability insurance workers have, and life insurance, very valuable life insurance. So young people who are contributing, if goodness, I hope, God forbid, walked out and had a terrible accident and could no longer work, they would be getting disability benefits. So it's a very valuable. There's something they're getting right now. It's not just waiting 40 years.
Yes, and then there's the cases we see where a father who's just been diagnosed with a terminal disease, and he's in his 50s, as well as his wife and 2 young children. And people don't realize what impact Social Security survivor benefits are going to have on that family for many years. So I'm preaching to the choir, though.
But that's exactly right. And it's a benefit. It came in 1939, but it's a benefit most people don't realize they have until some disaster strikes in their own lives. I mean, the 9/11, those families, the children receive benefits for that. It's there. And when you speak to most, a reasonably large group of people, usually someone has gotten survivor benefits. They're members of Congress who got survivor's benefits as children. So it's one of those things, and it's what it's supposed to provide. It's supposed to provide a sense of security, be there in the background, not something you're sitting there fretting about. But if tragedy happens, or if you have the good fortune to live to 110, because you can't afford Social Security, it's there for you.
Yeah. You've written quite a few books, and the one you co-authored with Eric Kingson, Why Social Security Isn't Going Broke, I don't like that term, and how expanding it will help us all. You published that in 2015. So you offer a powerful antidote for the 3-decade-long billionaire-funded campaign to make us believe that this vital institution is designed to collapse. Can you talk to us about this? Well, who wants us to believe that Social Security will collapse, and why?
Thank you so much for asking about that. And we've updated the book, Social Security Works. It's now, we have a new edition that's come out, Social Security Works for Everyone. And it I don't want to sound, it sounds like a conspiracy theory, except it's not a theory. It's not, Social Security has extremely widespread support. It always has, because it fills a basic need. Sometimes people talk about the need to modernize Social Security, but it's thoroughly modern. The concept is that as long as you're dependent on wages for food, shelter, clothing, and most of us are, virtually everyone is, then you need insurance against the loss of those wages. And that's what Social Security is. You could become unemployed. We don't think of unemployment insurance as Social Security, but it was part of the Social Security Act of 1935. You can become, as we were just talking about, so seriously disabled that you no longer can work. You can die leaving young children dependent on your earnings. And you could be have the good fortune to live to old age, and you have earned the right to retire. So that's what Social Security provides. And most people recognize it, support it, understand what a good deal it is, how efficient it is, and so forth. But there have always been some, starting from the very beginning, who either believe that the government should be, as the activist Grover Norquist said, shrunk to the size where it can be drowned in the bathtub, or this isn't an appropriate role of government, or simply are extremely wealthy, on Wall Street. Social Security gets people on Wall Street, no broker's fees, no money to be made, even though it's trillions of dollars going through Social Security every year. So there have always, from the beginning, been those who called it socialism, who opposed it. They argued that in the 1930s. It was a very colorful debate. It was part of the 1936, the presidential election, where Alf Landon, the Republican candidate, called it a hoax on the working man. In the 1950s, there were Goldwater conservatives who were opposed. President Eisenhower, and this is a fun thing to do for those watching and listening, you can find it online. President Eisenhower wrote a letter to his brother, which has now become public, that he said something about those who want to do away with Social Security are a few millionaires. Their number is negligent and they are stupid, is what he said.
I haven't heard of that.
Oh yes,
Okay.
I'll send you a link and you can.
I want that, yeah.
But they're not. But he was. I don't want to say they were super, but their number was negligible.
Yeah.
But they, because of their wealth, they have oversized influence and access. And in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, I give them credit. They were straightforward in their opposition. They said, it's socialism, it's this, it's that, it's not appropriate, it competes with private sector, so forth. And they always lost, but they stood up for what they believed in, which is what our democracy is about. Starting in the mid-70s, the conversation shifted. Either all those people vanished, which I don't believe, or they realized that their tactic was not working. So you had the Koch brothers, whose father had been a Texas newspaper owner who had railed against the New Deal, and they opposed Social Security. You had a very wealthy hedge fund manager named Pete Peterson, who had been Secretary of Commerce under Richard Nixon. And they started putting out funding organizations and writing essays themselves saying, we love Social Security, but it's not going to be there for you. It's not affordable. And they basically, today, in the past, you could know who was for Social Security and who was not, because you can say, I'm for Social Security, I'm against it. Now, everyone says they love it. So you have to ask more questions, because it's a little bit like the old Vietnam, we had to destroy the village to save it. You can tell who opposes Social Security, because no matter what, I always call it a solution in search of a problem, that the solution is cut Social Security or privatize it. And the problem shifts. It's unfair to African Americans because they don't live as long. It's unfair to young people because they could do, but there's always, it's a shifting reason of who's the victim, but the solution is the same. But it is not succeeded in actually cutting benefits, but it has succeeded in taking away the intangible benefit of security, because the younger you are, the less likely you are to believe you're going to get benefits.
Right. And I like that. You just said the intangible benefit of security. You don't have that security. And
That's
I felt
right.
that way until I was introduced to the topic over a decade ago. I was not even counting it as part of my retirement. And boy, did I find out I was wrong. But it's really hard to overcome that inertia that's in the media about it's going to go broke and it's not going to be there for you. So that's another book you wrote, Nancy, that I just love the title of this one. In 18, The Truth About Social Security, the Founders' Words, Refute Revisionist History, and Zombie Lies and Common Misunderstandings. That's great. So many people think that Social Security is somehow the cause of the federal deficit. What are the most prevalent zombie lies and common misunderstandings about Social Security?
Well, we've been talking about one, which is it's going broke.
Right.
It is not going broke. It has a $2.9 trillion surplus. It is being drawn down, and projections are that Congress has to provide more revenue to make sure benefits will keep being paid. But people have the idea that somehow you fall off a cliff, that once there are no reserves, you get nothing. And even the projections are that even if Congress were to do nothing whatsoever, which is unimaginable, people would still get 75 cents on the dollar. Now, that's not good enough. They should be getting 100% on the dollar. And in fact, I do have some good news, which is that although you're right, the media is really locked into this narrative that, and into the war of seniors against young people and so forth, these bait click kind of headlines. But the Democrats have now recognized that the nation is facing not a Social Security crisis, but a retirement income security crisis, that it's the private pension, the private employer side, where traditional pensions are disappearing, 401ks are not being shown to be adequate enough. And what the Democrats have been proposing, including President Biden, is to expand benefits and require the wealthiest to pay more to Social Security. It's not getting much reporting, but it is a kind of quiet movement where there's legislation that's been introduced in the House of Representatives with, if you can believe it, 200 co-sponsors. You only need 218 votes to pass it, but they already have 200.
You're talking about Congressman Larson's 2100. Yeah.
The Social Security 2100, a sacred trust he's had hearings, which I testified at, and he's trying to get a markup in the Ways and Means Committee, and we shall see. So that's one really big misunderstanding. That another is that somehow we can no longer afford Social Security. It's, we're so much wealthier now as a nation than we were in 1935 in the midst of the Depression, or in 1956 when disability insurance was enacted, and 1972 when the program was automatically adjusted. Wealth is not spread fairly. We've got income and wealth inequality, which is why I think it makes sense to require the wealthiest to contribute more to Social Security. But there's no question we're wealthier now than we've ever been in our history. And in fact, we're the wealthiest nation in the world. So there's no question we can afford Social Security. It's really a question of values and priorities. And poll after poll after poll shows the American people, as polarized as we are united about Social Security.
It's surprising that it's across gender, political parties, ages. And it really, when you mentioned the whole retirement planning financial situation, it saves us from ourselves, because the defined benefit pension plans are disappearing, and we are not doing a good job of contributing to 401ks and 403bs and IRAs. And we have to be forced to do that. Not everyone has the ability that, to earn enough money needed for those retirement years, which are 20, 30 years, possibly. So
there's so many, I talk about, it's a bit of a subtle difference, but that really what you need for retirement, certainly at its base, is insurance against loss of wages. Not savings are always important. It's, my parents always said that the first check you should write from your wages is to your savings account, because if you just try to save what's left over, you'll never have anything left over.
No.
But it's a hard thing to do, especially with stagnating wages and student debt and all the kinds of expenses that people have. But the idea of insurance is that we pool our, if it's savings or if it's a 401k, all the risk is focused on the individual.
Exactly.
You might reach retirement age when there's a downturn in the economy. All kinds of things. But insurance, especially one that's broad-based like Social Security, where we're pooling our risks across the nation. That way, when people say, how much should I save for retirement? I sometimes jokingly say to young people, well, how long do you plan to live? Because it really, if you're only going to live to 60, you don't need to save for retirement. If you're going to live to 110, you need to live a whole lot. It's something we don't know for individuals, but actuaries know for us very accurately as a group. That's why we have insurance, where some people die young, some people live extremely long, and we pool all of that. There are about 40 actuaries working at the Social Security Administration that are looking at fertility rates, mortality rates, as well as wage rates, immigration, all the kinds of things to determine.
And so the most recent book you already mentioned that you co-authored, the Social Security Works for Everyone, Protecting and Expanding the Insurance Americans Love and Count On. We talked about how there's so much widespread approval of Social Security. So why is it so darn hard right now for lawmakers to pass legislation that would extend the longevity? I feel like, wouldn't they want to be the ones that took credit for that and accomplished that?
It's such a good question. My assessment of it is that they are listening to the donor classes we talked about. There is a small group of ideologues who either don't like government or they're fine with government, but they want a share of the profits. They want to make money. They don't want to have to contribute. And the American people, poll after poll after poll, the thing about Social Security is that polling started back in the 1930s. Every candidate polls about Social Security. Our organization does, AARP does, Heritage Foundation, conservative organizations, liberal, or everybody polls about this issue. And the interesting thing is the polls always come out the same way, that the younger you are, the less likely you are to think you're going to get benefits. But if you ask the follow-up question, well, do you want it to be there? Everyone says yes, because they know they're going to need it. They do not want to see the benefits cut. They know they're modest. They're even willing to pay more if it's necessary, although they, of course, would rather wealthier people pay more, which I think is right. And they would like to see it expanded. They know it's more important than ever. What the elites in Washington have talked about for decades now is cutting it. And of course they're going to lose, because the American people, even the most conservative constituents, don't want that to happen. So they've tried to go behind closed doors. They've tried to, as they talk about it, hold hands and jump and all of that. And there are people like me and my colleagues who are watching and getting the word out when they're trying to do that and saying, no, we don't want this to pass. As I say, the Democrats have now realized that really that as important as making sure Social Security can pay full benefits it's a means to an end. The end is to provide basic economic security. And the question is, how much do we want to provide on a collective basis, this economic security? And I think most Americans and the Democratic Party has recognized that we need to increase the benefits and fully fund them. So that's working its way through. And I think there will be legislation sometime in the next few years.
I do too. And I am so excited to watch what happens with this particular bill. You mentioned it's insurance, and a lot of people don't even understand that. There's that old comic strip I used to read, Zitz, the comic, when my kids were that age, and he gets his first job and he says, who is FICA and why is he taking all this money? And, it's an insurance contribution act.
Yes, and thank you so much. I think that's so important to really stop, because it's FICA. Who's this FICA? But the Federal Insurance Contributions Act, and that was enacted in the 1930s when, today we're used to No Child Left Behind, or, these, the Patriot Act, or the CARES Act, these acronyms and these names that are Madison Avenue. Back then, when they enacted tax bills, they called them revenue acts. When they gave protection to workers to collectively bargain, they called it the National Labor Relations Act, not a fancy title. When they had minimum wage and maximum hours, the Fair Standards Labor Act. So when they called it the Federal Insurance Contributions Act, that's because that's what they were doing. These were our insurance contributions or premiums.
And that's another thing too, the wording contributions. And I'm constantly struggling against that, because the taxation of Social Security income is a really big topic. And in fact, I'm doing a webinar for Bob Powell on that next week. But that people are saying, well, how can they tax our income? We already paid taxes. Those weren't taxes. You were paying contributions. And that's another whole topic. But
and if you want, I'll give you a sentence or two, because that actually was part of the Social Security amendments of 1983.
It was the first one, wasn't it? That they started taxing.
That's right, because in 1935, there was some taxation, and the Roosevelt to fund the New Deal, and then World War II started increasing income taxes, and the Treasury Department had to decide what to do with income from Social Security. And it was just a regulatory decision to say, well, it's money from the government, so it makes no sense to, it's going out, why bring it back in? I think that was the wrong judgment back then. But a lot of people since then, a lot of experts said, no, I mean, we tax private retirement income as taxable income, and Social Security should be taxed the same way. Social Security, as you know, is extremely conservatively financed, where employees pay with after-tax dollars their contribution, and then employers match it dollar for dollar. The employers get tax deduction as a business expense, so half of the benefit, or half the contribution and half the benefit, and there wasn't a matching taking it into income. So what was done in 1983 was to treat Social Security the same way we treat private pension income. But it is very unpopular, you're exactly right. People don't like it. And one thing in the 2100 Act is to increase the thresholds for when people have to pay. So the Democrats are giving a tax cut for Social Security benefits.
Yeah, I mean, I understand where it all starts from with the 50% that was first taxed in 83, and then it went up to 85%. But I just worked on that slide, and the number of people, retirees whose Social Security income is taxed now is over 50%, and it was 10% in when it started. So that's a part of the problem, is it hasn't kept up with inflation, and it's sneaky. It's hidden. People don't understand that until they start taking out all their other retirement assets at 72 or.
No, and quite frankly, I mean, the problem is that, as much as there's talk about, and this is another misconception and so for somehow seniors are all living the life of, Riley down in gated communities, playing golf all day and all of that. Most seniors, Social Security has reduced poverty, but most seniors are just above the poverty line. So right. Any kind of serious illness could push them into poverty and so forth. People who are wealthy enough to pay income tax are actually the wealthier of seniors, but that's still a low-income group. And so part of the problem, I think, is that people are paying taxes who really are just barely getting by. And that's part of the reason I think it's so controversial.
It is, and because the average wage for couples this year, the average Social Security income for married couples is now $33,000 a year, which is up into that 50% bracket. So, and the singles is creeping up. So even the average, and that doesn't include the lower
yes.
income. It really is affecting people that I don't really think it should be.
Yep. As I say, Chairman John Larson, who chairs the Social Security Subcommittee, and his is the 2100 Act, he's right there with you. He wants to raise those thresholds, wants to raise it to 50,000 for married couples.
Yeah, I want to see it be adjusted like all the other figures are for Social Security. And what is this about the $15 minimum wage? Why you've talked about that's a win for Social Security, and why stop there? Can you tell us about that? What other changes should happen for lower and middle class paychecks, and how does that affect Social Security?
There's so many good policies that would benefit, as a byproduct, would benefit Social Security. I mean, it's really outrageous that minimum wage workers are not able to survive. The whole idea of a minimum wage is to have a decent standard of living. And there, as you know, there's been a real fight for 15, and that's been a few years ago. And yet Congress has still not enacted an increase in the federal minimum wage. If Congress were to enact an increase in the federal minimum wage, of course it would be good up and down the income scale, because minimum wage workers would get more, which means those earning above minimum wage would get more. It would just bump the salaries up. So it's the right policy as current wages, but it also helps deferred wages, because Social Security, it's another way that it's so responsibly managed that people pay on their first dollars of earnings. So if you're earning minimum wage, you're paying Social Security contributions on your first dollar. If you're earning more, you'll pay somewhat higher Social Security contributions, and you'll get a larger Social Security benefit when you retire. So it's a win. If we could get away from the equity gap between men and women, and the gender gap in wages by equalizing up. You don't want to bring men down, bring women up.
Yeah.
That also would make a significant improvement in Social Security financing. Similarly, if we increased immigration, and immigrants actually are a benefit for Social Security. They're a little bit akin to women having more children. It's younger people in the workforce. Immigrants by culture often have larger families. They tend to be younger. So they're all contributing to Social Security. I think it's moral, sound, humane policy, and it also helps all of us.
It does, and it's so much of what you just said is counterintuitive to what most people think. One of the courses I wrote was Social Security and Immigrants, and there are so many misconceptions and
Yes.
really inaccurate information on that.
In fact, people don't tend to talk about it, but people say, oh, these undocumented workers, they're getting my Social Security.
Exactly.
No, they cannot get Social Security. And in fact, many of them are contributing because they're working on a false Social Security number. So they're paying in, but they're never going to get a penny in benefits.
Or they they may even have ITIN, individual tax ID numbers.
Exactly.
And they're actually a benefit because they are paying in and they aren't often taking it out.
And in fact, Social Security, as you say, no one talks about it, but undocumented workers improve Social Security's financing by billions of dollars every year. Now, I don't think that's right. I think if someone, whether documented or undocumented, is working and paying, they've earned the benefit the same way they've earned their salary. I don't think we should reach in their pockets and take their wages back. And the same thing, I think they should get Social Security, but that is not the law. The law is they cannot get benefits.
No, and that's we won't go into immigration. Talk to us about the state-by-state reports that you put out at Social Security Works. What are those?
Social Security Works. I love the name of our organization because it says what we believe, which is Social Security Works. And we are an educational organization, and we put out a variety of reports. Social Security Works for women, Social Security Works for African Americans, Social Security Works for children, and so forth. But we also put out reports for every state. Social Security Works for California, Social Security Works for Texas. The Social Security Administration puts out the number of lots of data going down to both the congressional and county level. So we put out, we're doing it annually. Now we've gotten a little bit behind because of so much other work we have, but we'll be putting them out again in a report for all 50 states, for the territories. We put a number of them out in Spanish, and then we put one, Social Security Works for the United States, that has all of it, but it shows how much money is flowing into each congressional district. ARP has found that for every dollar of benefits that goes into a district, it creates $2 in economic growth. So it's creating jobs because, as we were just talking, people who get Social Security tend to be low income. They're not putting their money, in a Swiss bank account. They are spending it in their local communities on necessities. So it's helping the economy, and it shows all kinds of statistics. The number of children who get Social Security, people don't realize it, but Social Security is the nation's largest children's program because of the survivor and disability family benefits that are provided. Yeah. So you can go to our website, socialsecurityworks.org, and we've got under resources, we have state reports, and you can look up your state and we try to put in stories also about people who receive those benefits. So you've got both the personal and the data. We also, another report that I really like, and we're updating now, it's not out yet, but we did it a few years ago, Social Security serving those who serve our nation, because Social Security is extremely important for veterans, for their families who've lost a loved one. They're the survivor benefits and so forth.
Well, I'm going to put a link to that on our website under our resources, because our analysts are in all different states. And I think that's just a wonderful sort of tidbit of information for your local area to have. What do you think FDR would think about the way we care for and think about Social Security as a society today?
I'm so glad you asked that. People often, sometimes you'll read commentators saying, oh, he wouldn't recognize the program, it's so changed. Oh. And I always laugh and say, he would recognize it, but his question would be, you haven't done more? He called it, when he signed it into law in 1935, he called it a cornerstone in an institution that is being built, in a structure that's being built, but is by no means complete. He saw that every generation would add to it. He wanted what essentially is Medicare for all, guaranteed health insurance, and almost proposed it in 1935 but thought it was just too much at that point. He wanted disability, long-term disability insurance, which was added in 1956. He wanted short-term disability, which we could think of as paid family leave and other kinds of sick pay and so forth. They were talking about that back in the 1930s. And these were all part of the vision of Social Security. As I said, we added in 1939, we got survivors benefits and family benefits. Then we had World War II, so things came to a halt. But soon after the war, they started increasing benefits. They added in 1956 disability insurance. They added 1965, they added Medicare and Medicaid, which, you know, Medicare is also part of the FICA, Federal Insurance Contributions. 72, they automatically indexed the program, but then progress stopped. And I think the both the Democrats and Republicans thought, you know, we're afraid, I don't know quite why they deviated, but they stopped seeing it as an institution that is growing, that they wanted to really see it increase. But the Democrats are back now there. And I think the Republicans, I think if the 2100 Act comes for a vote, it doesn't have any Republican co-sponsors, but I'll be surprised if there aren't some Republican votes because it is what their constituents want.
Yeah, yep, and they're going to listen to that. What would you like? I know you've mentioned several times about taxing the higher earners. I think that taxable earnings limit should disappear and all income should be taxed. But what else would you like? What would you like to see as an expansion of Social Security, and what needs to happen for those changes?
Well, the most experts say that people need about 70% of pre-retirement pay to maintain your standard of living in retirement, which is the goal, to be able to stop work and not have to, you know, sell your home and move and with your children and so forth as they used to before Social Security, but just to be able to maintain your standard of living. But Social Security for an average worker earning, you know, about $50,000 only receives about 35% of pre-retirement pay, which is not enough. It's progressive so that lower income workers earn a higher percentage, higher income workers earn a somewhat lower percentage, but none of the rates are enough to be able to retire and maintain your standard of living. So there's talk about across the board increases, but they're talking about 2 or 3%, 5%, which is good, but I would 10%, 15%, double it. I mean, I would have really substantial, given how many advantages Social Security has. It's very efficiently administered. Less than a penny of every dollar is paid out in benefits. More than 99 cents is paid out in administration. More than 99%, 99 cents on the dollar is paid in benefits. It's portable from job to job. It's good for short-term workers as well as long-term steady workers. So it's good for everyone. It's better than any product you can get in the private sector. So I would dramatically expand it in both targeted ways and across the board. To pay for it, Social Security has 3 streams of revenue. Its primary source has been and always will be the FICA contributions, the premiums paid by employees matched by their employers. Then there, from the beginning, has been interest on the investments because the money that's held in trust is invested and there's investment income. Then the third, which came in 1983, is what we were talking about before. It's the taxation of benefits. But the wrinkle is that instead of money going into the general fund, it's paid back to Social Security. That is the only progressive source. The FICA, because of that wage base, it's proportionate up to $147,000 in 2022, which is the maximum in 2022. And then it's regressive. You pay 0 after that, 6.2% before. The investment income is something that's shared. We all have paid into the fund, and the investment income is for all of us. The taxation of benefits, so the benefits are taxed, are considered income for federal income tax purposes, is the only progressive source, and that amounts to about 3% of Social Security's income. We have been witnessing over the last 20 years a dramatic increase in income and wealth inequality that's very destabilizing, and as a byproduct has really taken money away from Social Security, because more and more people at the top are earning more than that maximum, while everyone else's wages has stagnated. So given all of that, I think we should be thinking about a progressive source of revenue, whether it's a wealth tax, whether it's a surtax on income tax, whether it's a financial transactions tax. There are a number of taxes which are good policy but are very hard to enact, but I think would be easier to enact if the money were paid to Social Security. I think that's the only way we might be able to get that. And we're still only talking about 4 or 5% of Social Security's income, but it's enough to really expand the program.
Right. Do you have any opinions on those investments changing the way that the funds that are in the trust funds are invested? Because I've heard about that too.
Yes. So the ways that you can increase the income, you can increase the premium, either the rate or that base that we were talking about. You can increase the investment income, or you could find another source of progressive revenues. I was just talking about. From the beginning, Congress has said that Social Security's surplus has to be invested in the safest investment on earth, which are treasury bonds backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. The idea is that these are the people's pension, it's workers' money, and they want to be very safe with it. But every one of your financial advisors will advise their clients that you should diversify your portfolio, that it's good to have a mix of bonds and stocks. And from the beginning, there have been talk about investing some of those assets in, now you don't want to invest them in individual stocks because that's makes people a little bit nervous about government ownership and so forth.
Yeah.
But you could invest in broad-based index funds where there's no voting, where it's very insulated. It's kind of like the Federal Reserve. It's got a board that's and that would increase the investment income. Interestingly, Chairman Larson, in his first iteration back in 2013, did propose that. But what he found was that people confused that with privatization. It's quite different, because when you invest in individual accounts, you are subject to the rise and fall yourself. If it's invested in for all of us, then your benefit is still guaranteed. You're going to get that benefit no matter what happens.
Right.
And the government never has to disinvest because it's got unlimited time horizon. The problem is that I think it's great policy, but I think the politics are hard. It would take a lot of explaining. So I think if I were in charge, I would say, yeah, let's do it. But if I had to run for office, I might say, well, maybe not. It's a little hard to explain.
Perception is a big part of it.
Exactly. And again, the idea is to have people feel secure. And you don't want them to think, oh, the stock market's falling, that's going to hurt my Social Security.
Well, there's so many other things that can be tweaked that can increase the longevity of the program, I think.
Absolutely. As I say, it's a matter of values. It's not a matter of affordability. And I don't think it would be hard to reach consensus about it.
Well, that's so encouraging to hear you say that. So the current inflation is definitely affecting those who are collecting Social Security, since COLA really doesn't keep up with that. But does inflation have an impact on Social Security itself, whether positive or negative? I mean, you talked about that back in the 80s when there was huge inflation. So
yes,
how does that affect it?
Well, one of the real strengths of Social Security makes it better than private sector vehicles is that no matter what the inflation rate is, there is an adjustment that is made every January based on what the inflation was. It's technically the third quarter over the third quarter, but it's basically what's happened with inflation. Now, we've argued that the measure is not accurate for seniors and people with disabilities because it undermeasures healthcare costs for that group. And that's the healthcare costs have been going up very, very fast. And so we've been talking, and in fact, the Larson bill, the Democrats have rallied behind a more accurate cost of living adjustment. But to have any kind of automatic adjustment is unusual and an extremely valuable, and certainly at a time now when we're experiencing such high inflation.
Right.
But at the same time, when there's high inflation, there tends to be higher wages. So that means that people are contributing more, they're earning more, and they're contributing more. So
Right.
generally, wages tend to go up faster than prices, not every year, but over time. So it shouldn't be a problem for Social Security. It's really a benefit of the program.
Yeah. Oh, it's just so wonderful to talk to you. Where can people go to learn more about you or get in touch? You want to give the Social Security Works information again or anything
Yes.
else?
Our website is socialsecurityworks.org. We have lots of resources. If you want to sign up, we send out maybe more emails than you're going to want, but send out emails pretty much daily, letting you know what's going on. And just an interesting point that we define Social Security the way FDR defined it, and that was basic economic security. So we are looking at lowering drug prices, which indirectly raises your Social Security. If you're paying less out, your benefits go further. We are talking about expanding Medicare. So we're involved with lots and lots of issues beyond, as you know, our core is Social Security, the Old Age Survivors Disability program. But we look at these also, and if you sign up, we will give you up to the minute what is going on in the halls of Congress on these important issues.
Great. Is there anything you'd like to add that I haven't asked you?
The only thing, since you do have both financial advisors and people who are thinking about their own retirement, I think it's important that, you know, I sometimes get questions like, oh, I hear it's going bankrupt. Should I grab my benefits as soon as I turn 62? And really, you got to look at your own individual situation. If you can wait until age 70, your benefits will be higher. You get permanent monthly increased benefits for the rest of your life. And you really want to be looking ahead to when you're 90 and when you might, your spouse might live beyond you and so forth, and what you and your spouse will be getting. The program will be there. Don't worry that somehow you got to grab those benefits because they won't be there. I hope what I'd like to leave people with is the security that Social Security is supposed to provide. That don't believe the scare headlines. Just make sure you vote for members who don't just say they love Social Security, because everyone will say that. Ask them, will you expand it or will you cut it, and vote accordingly.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I could ask you more questions, but we will have to stop here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I very much enjoyed it.
Thank you.